Welcome to the Happily Ever After Cold Case Podcast. We're your hosts, Alyssa and Marissa, distant cousins who take on distant cases. Come with us as we explore the crimes of legendary tales of the past. I am so high.
You're high right now?
Yeah. On Xanax.
There you go.
Yeah. Okay.
I wonder if Cinderella had Xanax and therapy, if the whole story would have happened.
I don't think it would have. I think of that. Think of the childhood trauma.
Right? It's just all trauma. And then she
Yeah.
goes and she marries some dude that she met for like an
15
hour.
minutes. An hour.
Yeah, an hour for 3 nights.
And he only wants her for her shoe size.
Right. He doesn't know her name. She knows nothing about him, and she's like, "Yeah, this is a good person to hitch my life
A
to."
good fit. And it's kind of bothersome too that, if you think about it, that you would just want to marry somebody. Did he wear the same shoe size? Was it a cross-dressing thing? I mean, what?
Well, apparently, it can't be drag since it's now illegal in Tennessee because apparently that is dangerous. Although I guess it wasn't dangerous for the last 100+ years.
Well, no, you can still shoot people. You just can't.
You just
wear
can't.
Women's shoes
Right.
if
Okay.
you're a guy.
So
yeah.
What is it? The movie Some Like It Hot.
Some Like It Shot.
Right. And then there was a couple other. What was it with Dustin Hoffman? Tootsie.
Oh, Tootsie.
Yeah.
Yeah, come on.
So I guess that's illegal now too. For some reason, I don't remember. I don't remember.
Yeah, I'm
school
not sure.
shooting after Tootsie came out, but
no,
the people in Tennessee apparently know more than the rest of the world.
Yeah, well, I had a somebody I knew, when I was like 18, and a nice Jewish girl, and she was moving to Tennessee, and I said to her, "Are you out of your freaking mind?"
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know.
But all right, so Cinderella.
What fairy tale we
talking
got?
about childhood trauma and questionable legal issues. Cinderella.
A dream is a wish.
This case just I still can't really wrap my head around this case and figure out why child services, local and federal police and law enforcement just were never involved. I can because you have head of a nation involved.
Right.
But still, just very, very surprising.
But here's the thing that I dabble in lots of I don't dabble. I delve into genealogy, and I have access to like newspapers.com, historical newspapers, and nothing. I found nothing in any records historically in newspapers, nothing about this case, which leads me to believe it was completely swept under the rug.
It probably was. But let's look at this. So you have a young woman, she's living with her mom and dad. Mom gets sick, and only about a year later does dad get remarried. Now, there's no information about whether he knew the woman he married while his wife was sick. I am just saying that it's only a year. That's a pretty short time between your wife dying and getting remarried.
Not in those years though, because
that's true.
Remember there was a whole lot of this thing of men didn't know how to take care of children, so they married quickly.
Yeah,
not even necessarily for love, but just to have a mother for their child.
Yeah, so he remarries, and she already has 2 children. And I did note that there was no mention about her past, whether she was an unmarried woman, because I do, today it's not as much of a stigma, but back then it was very, very stigmatized. But there's no information about if she was married, who her husband was, what happened to him. So that's a little bit curious, but I don't think, I think that's just if you're curious about things. I don't think there's anything really going on with that, or it's really relevant.
I don't know. I'm sensing a whole Tiger King thing there. I mean, maybe she offed her first husband. I don't know. I don't know.
I mean, she ended up doing fine because Cinderella's father was I'm not going to go with landed gentry type wealthy, but he was wealthy enough. He was doing well enough.
He had money.
Yeah, he was doing well. Yeah, he was doing well.
So
they get married.
But that lends a lot of credence to the whole maybe she offed her first husband.
Yeah, maybe, or the wife.
Well, especially if you consider her attitude going forward. Mm-hmm. Leopards don't change their spots. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking there's something happening in that first marriage that we maybe should try and find out about. I don't know if we can.
Right. Maybe there's a pattern of behavior. Which something it's very important. That pattern of behavior is very useful when you're looking at someone's MO, their modus operandi.
Right.
In different types of criminal behavior. Now, granted, she didn't. There is no evidence that anyone else was physically harmed or killed, except for the dead wife and the dead husband. But again, we have no information. This is purely speculation. I don't even know if it's relevant to this. It really, really could have just been disease, war, what have you. There just isn't a lot of information. And at that point, medicine wasn't as great. I mean, I know we have a lot of modern medical marvels, just even in the last 2 decades. So that's not saying that anything nefarious could have happened. It's just completely speculation.
True, but as a behavioral, a human behavioral kind of specialist, I feel like, and it's a feeling, but I feel like there's more to meet the eye on that, because she's not a nice person.
No,
and I just.
Although just because you're a nice person doesn't mean you off your husband. It just means you're kind of an asshole.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
But she was an asshole to her stepdaughter, Cinderella. So much so that so I don't know if you know, but her name wasn't actually Cinderella. However, her real name, the name she had at birth, is completely lost. There's no court record of her name. I've been unable to find any birth certificate with her original name. Her name on her death certificate was Cinderella, or otherwise known as Ashputel, from the local dialect. Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's gone. So
there's no and how did you find out that this was not her original name?
The records back then, and it's not super long ago, but long ago enough that they're not as clear as they are today. Everything is input into a system, and we've got name change records and all that kind of good stuff. So it did take a little bit of digging and investigating to discover that Cinderella was actually a name change or a nickname. Because if you note, there is no last name. And in most cases, it'll be an individual and then either a last name or a daughter or son of. So their first name is their given name, and then the patronym or the village
patronymic
indicates where they're from or what family they're in. And Cinderella has no patronym.
Well, yeah, but she could have been like a Cher, Prince, She could have been a one-namer. Yeah,
although then that information would have been evident on later documents after she was married. Although prior to her marriage, she still would have had a patronym, but there is no patronym, and there is no change in later documents.
Do we even know what Dad's name was?
We don't. That's very
weird.
Curious. Yeah. We don't know her mom's name. We don't know her dad's name. All we have are the information on the stepmother, stepsisters, and then her family later on after she was married.
Yeah, I find that super, super odd.
It is. It is very curious, especially since, granted, records weren't taken in the most neat and organized fashion back then, but there were still a lot of records. There were still a plethora of records regarding her later in life. So this absolute lack of any record of her early life is very curious.
Yeah. It you know, there's you know, I don't know. Why didn't investigators at the time of this crime, why didn't investigators dig more? I mean, granted, I get it. Behavioral psychology and criminal psychology is a whole, new field, relatively speaking, from when this crime happened. But still, you would think there would have been some type of investigation into that.
That's a good question. And that brings me to my next point is there's no information about any investigation by the Department of Child Services. None whatsoever. Because we know that her mother died at a young age, but we don't actually know at what age. But we do know it was fairly young, as she was young enough to still to listen and to obey her stepmother when her stepmother began this systemic abuse. So we do know that it's somewhat of a young age. We also know that her name Cinderella stuck, and she was using that name long enough for enough years that it became her name. So while we don't know the exact age, we do know that she was at least potentially maybe a young to middle-aged child at this point. And the fact that there is no information about whether there was an investigation by Department of Child Services, if they investigated her treatment by her stepmother, if they investigated the negligence and potential abandonment by her father, there are no records, and it's very curious.
Well, and curiouser, I can't even talk. Curiouser still is the fact that, I mean, it apparently, this is somewhere in the French countryside, this whole tale, this tale of woe, and it's a French prince, not of Bel Air, but the French kept pretty good records, and this is disturbing. I mean, I've gone back into through some of the genealogical sites and looked at French records, and there's no record of a Cinderella.
No. But we know she existed because we have her marriage record, we have her children's birth records, her death record. We do have plenty of information about her later life. It's just this lack of information early life, lack of birth certificate, her mother or father's name, her mother's death certificate, her original birth name, her patronym, no information from Children's Services, no information from any local law enforcement. So we don't even know if there was ever an investigation, if anyone ever called Children's Services, or if anyone even noticed that she was being abused.
And here's another question. What year do we think this took place? This crime?
Oh, I think maybe about 100 years ago or so. We're not quite sure.
I think I think it's.
We do have some records, and we do have her. Like I said, we do have her death record and marriage records, so we can at least begin to place when the abuse began. Frame. Mm-hmm. We do have a record, a time frame. Yeah.
Yeah, because okay, so it this is interesting. So it looks to have been taken place around the 1600s.
Oh,
interesting. This okay. And again, this is not verified. I'm reading this on, anti-Google, which we know, misinformation these days
yes.
is rampant.
Yeah.
But it seems the story, the telling of this crime seems to come from an Italian in 1634, prior to the investigators, the Grimm's brothers, coming upon it and writing about the case. So there's some very strange discrepancy. Was she Italian? Was she French? I mean, granted, borders often changed in those years, but
that's very curious, and that also
it
brings
is very
a lot
curious.
of questions about the
Perhaps
veracity.
her records are more in France, as they're more in Italy, and we're looking in the wrong place.
Yeah, and that also brings a question as to what records that place it at 100 years ago. What records are those? Are those copies of the original record that have been translated and have been misdated? Are they records of someone else who had the same name? Which is also very curious because it's not exactly a common name, but it's very, very curious now.
Yeah, it really does bring to question. Was this a case from the 1600s? Was it a case from 100 years ago? Which puts a whole slant on things, based on being able to find out more about her original family history.
Right. And remember, if this actually did happen in the 1600s, we're not going to have the same level of investigation and law enforcement. And at that point, there was no such thing as the Department of Children's Services. So there would have been
a lot more sense.
Yeah, and there would have been no investigation. So that does clear up some things, definitely, for sure. But I do want to move on to the biggest crime that we're actually talking about. Now this whole thing about her childhood and the abuse and abandonment that occurred there is relevant, I believe, because it does at least give some motivation for what happened later on. It helps explain, Agreed. I think, a little bit some of the motivation. Maybe today, with the information that we have today, we could look at if there was any potential mental illness going on. If anything like
there
that
had
was
to be.
Right. If anything like that was potentially a factor. But the crimes that we're actually very interested in right now, that are the reason for this for this discussion, is if you remember, there was a little bit of a snippet about when she married the prince. And I think that marriage, that's very questionable. And again, that discussion on her history of abuse and abandonment, I definitely think had an impact on her decision to marry someone that she had only met on 3 occasions for maybe a couple hours tops. He didn't know her name. She had no information on him. So very questionable why someone would want to hitch themselves to a single person just based on that limited information. But if you remember,
hang tight. I get that, but what's the prince's excuse?
Yeah, I do kind of understand her perspective, but his is very questionable.
His is very, because look at the current monarchies, where bless their little hearts, but as recently as the 80s, when he was Prince Charles, being forced to marry Princess Diana because she was more suitable. I personally don't understand his attraction to Camilla when he had filet mignon. But it's, to each his own. But that's only like the last century, the end of the last century. So I'm finding it really, really hard to understand the motivation and the permission of his father to allow him to, the heir to the throne, to go chasing after some young woman with a missing shoe.
Yeah, that's very curious, especially given her lack of finances, her lack of authority, any type of
Her lack of a last name.
yeah, lack of a last name, any type of political benefit that would bring to their monarchy or to their
She could have been a
family.
spy. I mean, he would have been forced to look for a woman of stature with a dowry that or a kingdom, to add to their ruling party. It's just there's so much unanswered here.
Well, speaking of dowries and questions, it is now time for a sponsor break.
And we're back.
Yep.
So, what other crimes cold cases have you come across? It's the amount of cold cases is astounding to me.
It is, but I think this one caught my eye, partially because some of the lack of information in her early life, like we just discussed, her rise in standing and social standing, that was just explosive rise in social standing. And
ladder climber for sure.
Oh yeah,
social climber, social butterfly.
Oh,
absolutely.
completely. I mean, I'm not faulting it. I'm not faulting her.
No.
To each your own, but definitely social climber there. But what really got me was just the bloody nature of this. It was extremely bloody, extremely vicious, and
it's violent.
And violent. And there were the fact that there was no investigation and so little information for such a high profile crime really caught my attention.
Well, what I'm really finding interesting is that if the original crime happened in the 1600s in Italy, how did the Grimm's brother detectives end up writing and taking on this cold case? But they kind of talked about it as if it had happened in France, which is really peculiar.
Well, and who hired them? From what we can see, it looks like it was completely swept under the rug. There was a whole top-level conspiracy to keep this out of the news, out of the news cycles, out of society, just keep everything quiet. So who hired them to begin with?
Hush, hush. But, at the same time, something tells me these two brother detectives, may have, created an agency and a whole business based on this. These cold cases.
That's something to look into. Maybe I'll start looking in and seeing if they've investigated any other cases like this. That would be really interesting. Yeah.
I mean, I know they did the Hansel, the two children that killed the witch. We touched on that last time.
Mm-hmm.
So it warrants, I think, looking into whether these two brothers started this detective agency purely for cold cases, and they were not actually perhaps current investigators of their time.
That's really something to think about. Yeah, and I wonder if there could be some other investigation into that, and to really clarify whether they themselves were looking at cold cases hundreds of years old, or if they were looking at something more recent and trying to investigate a recent current case.
It could have been coincidental that they were similar too.
Who knows?
There's also the theory, we think of Jack the Ripper as the first serial killer, but what if, this goes back even much further, and it's mind-blowing.
Just mind-blowing. Absolutely astounding, confounding even.
Yeah.
Crazy.
I mean, I kind of find it hard to believe that the first serial killer was Jack the Ripper in 1888. I think it just wasn't talked about, and people just didn't care.
Yeah.
Your kid disappeared, or your your sibling disappeared, and you're like, oh well, I guess they moved away. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Who knows? Or it was some mystical beast. Like some
a dragon.
some witch in the forest who lured children with candy.
Yeah. Or a dragon it's unbelievable. I just don't know.
Yeah. Definitely something to look into, though. Something very, very curious. Yeah. But at least with this one, we do know, we do have some facts on this case, which thankfully the Grimm's investigators were able to dig up and were able to find. So I really want to talk about after the wedding.
Okay, I know very little about what happened after the wedding, so I'm curious.
Okay,
I'm curious.
well, so
you've got my ears.
We've already discussed the history of abuse, especially by the stepmother. The stepfather, I think, the father, I'm sorry, is very, very clearly abandoned Cinderella. So there's a lot of abandonment.
He's checked out.
He's gone. Right. But there was definitely a good amount of abuse perpetrated by the stepmother, and there's no information that this was ever investigated or law enforcement was ever involved. And not only was the stepmother abusive, but there is some evidence, some implication that the stepsisters were also involved in perpetrating the abuse for many, many years. So here's why this is important.
Like mother, like daughter. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now here's why this is important. So after the wedding, stepmother and daughters have obviously realized that Cinderella is now gone from the lowest level of society to the highest, obviously. And as a stepmother did before when she lost her first husband, or as we discussed earlier, maybe he died in some other circumstances. But
questionable circumstances.
As her first husband was gone and she was able to climb financially and socially by marrying Cinderella's father, she now wanted to do additional social climbing. And her daughters, Cinderella's stepsisters, wanted to benefit from that rise in social status as well. So, while Cinderella is on the way to the wedding, her stepmother and sisters are walking with her. And from the reports that I've seen, I've read that each woman's eyes, the left eye in particular, was pecked out. Now, some reports say that it was by birds. There has been some information and some speculation that Cinderella may have talked to birds. I'm a little curious. I'm wondering if there may have been some mental health, as we also discussed. Yeah.
This is a secondary crime. Mm-hmm. I'm a revenge crime.
I don't know. But their left eyes were removed. And it wasn't done with anesthesia. It wasn't done in a medical environment, but they were. I'm going
to jump in here again from a behavioral standpoint. That's a crime of passion. It's very violent. It's a crime of passion. Yeah. The attacking of the eye. I see some sort of, and I say that ironically. I see the pecking out of the eyes as some sort of crime of passion. It's purpose. It's there's it's not accidental. It's not it's less revenge, and it seems to be more can you see me now? You know what I mean? There's something sinister there.
Yeah. And especially, I think this adds to your point. Not only was the eye removed, and viciously so, since there is some information that indicates that these women were bleeding profusely, but there is no indication that any medical providers or emergency services were ever contacted. There's no evidence that they ever received any type of immediate medical care.
And now, question: do we have any records of them after the marriage? Because did they bleed out? Were they left to bleed out?
Well, I know they were present at the wedding. So they were present at the wedding without having been able to change, and so covered in blood. having received no medical attention. And then on their way out after the wedding, the other eye was removed. So by the end of the day here, both of their eyes have been removed. Now, again, there was no information or evidence that medical services were ever contacted, that these women ever received either immediate medical care or medical care in general. And on top of that, both stepsisters already had pre-existing injuries which limited their mobility. So if we're going to go back a little bit, prior to the wedding, the prince, who, as we discussed, the prince didn't actually know Cinderella's name, which is questionable why he didn't.
Yeah, that's weird.
He didn't know her name. So in order to find her, he was searching everywhere to see if someone could fit in the shoe she had lost. And eventually he came to her home. She was in the kitchen in her fireplace working, and he tried the shoe on the first stepsister. Now it didn't fit. So in order to make it fit, the stepmother had her daughter cut off her big toe, and then it fit. I mean, granted, she's missing a toe.
That's cruelty. That's cruelty. Yeah.
But it fit. And it wasn't until the prince noticed all of the blood in the shoe that he realized what had happened. So he goes back and he talks to the second daughter. And again, it doesn't fit because her feet are obviously not Cinderella's feet. And the only thing I can imagine is these were custom fitted shoes. And
how does she get? How does this girl that is being abused and she's cleaning fireplaces for her family get custom fitted shoes?
That's a great question. And I wonder if that was something that played into the prince's decision to marry her, because he saw these shoes and he could see that they were fairly high quality, potentially even custom. And in order to afford that level of customization, must be someone who has certain resources.
Right. Now, did they have red soles? Do we know that?
We don't know.
Do we know if they had?
I don't know.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Just a thought. Just a thought.
But I'm pretty sure they were at least made in Italy. Yeah.
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 Well, and the stepsisters didn't have shoes like that.
No.
No. This is a girl that's being abused. She's got expensive shoes. She didn't appear though to be the social climber. It's the two and I'm going to be fair here. The two lesser attractive half sisters, were very much social climbers. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, one of them willing to cut off her toe and the other willing to cut off her heel.
Right. So there's just
potential damage
it.
to her Achilles tendon.
Yeah. Never be able to walk again.
No.
There's something odd. So after the wedding, do we know where they went? Did they stay married? Did they live in the palace? Do we know that?
Well, so we do know that Cinderella and the prince did stay married.
Were they still happy?
Well, I don't know if they were happy. They unfortunately, there isn't enough information to determine if they were happy, although they did have several children. But after the wedding is actually the last time that we hear about the stepmother and the stepsisters. Now, we already know the stepsisters have limited mobility, but the fact that the stepmother...
they're blind.
Well, they're blind and with limited mobility. But the fact that all three of them are no longer in any type of document is very, very curious. And
very strange.
Really, really makes me wonder if this was not just a dismemberment, but also a murder.
Actually, now that I think about it, you mentioned this the last time we spoke, and I did do a little research, and I did find a document that claimed that Cinderella and the prince lived happily ever after, which I question.
How do we define happiness? What is the definition of happiness? And what is the definition of happiness then versus the definition of happiness now? It's a very, very mobile definition. It's not very strict.
Well, and just going from a personal standpoint, I mean, even if I didn't like my step family, if they were maimed and they're blind and all of the, I'm going to feel some empathy. I don't know that I would live happily ever after.
Although, would you, if you had been subjected to years and years of abuse, so much so that you no longer have your own name anymore? Maybe that document indicating that they lived happily ever after is actually a confession. Maybe the bodies were hidden and they lived happily ever after because Cinderella had ended up murdering her mother and stepsisters, and the prince and his family, now that Cinderella is part of that, covered it up. Yeah.
Well, and in those days, I mean, it's not like today where, the monarchy does something wrong and on some level they're held accountable. They were, in those days, they were the law of the land.
Yeah.
So it's not like it was going to be investigated again. That's
yeah.
wow.
So maybe that happily ever after is something that we have to look at as a potential confession.
Or what does happily ever after mean in that time in the 1600s?
Yeah.
What does it mean? Does happily ever after, is it an indication we got away with it? Is that happily ever after?
I don't know. That's something to think about. That's something that I really do wish that other investigators had reviewed.
Yeah.
Because now all we have are just some spotty records and context clues, but we don't actually have anything concrete.
Yeah. I mean, there's all this childhood trauma, and then there's mutilation, and there's blood, and there's all this additional trauma that comes. There's no talk of PTSD here. There's no talk of anything but happily ever after, and that is really curious. Was she a psychopath? I mean, is there that possibility?
I don't know. I mean, so psychopaths are generally born that way. Their brains are actually a little bit different.
They're wired differently.
They are, and you can actually see a different their brains firing in different ways than someone who's not a psychopath utilizing an EKG. Obviously, that's kind of hard to test unless they give you permission. But you can also see different formulations, or not formulations, but different brain functions, and actual different parts of their brain are a little bit different than an average person when it's being dissected.
Right.
So maybe she was a sociopath, because a sociopath is someone who, again, maybe predisposed, have psychopathic tendencies along the checklist, but doesn't actually have those specific brain function, but could be socialized in such a way to be a sociopath. So yeah, that's something that we should look into as well, I think.
And I'll tell you, I just read an article about, Beethoven's hair and DNA.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know where they're buried? Has anyone ever exhumed Cinderella and the prince's body to, maybe check some of these things out?
I don't know. I will have to look into that. I don't actually know.
I mean, I don't know what the expense involved would be. I mean, and that's saying that we even have a concrete, burial place.
Right.
But I would think we would, considering he was a prince, assuming he probably became the king.
Mm-hmm. And then she would be the queen, so we should not only have a concrete burial place, but we should be able to identify them without the need of a descendant to do a DNA comparison.
Right. And here's another thing. Have you ever looked in the records to see if there was a Queen Cinderella?
That is something that I did look for, and there was not a Queen Cinderella. There was just Queen. So I don't know if she decided, if she personally decided upon ascending the throne to lose the name Cinderella, since it was given to her as a a token of
Bad
her
memories.
abusive home, a bad memory.
Yeah.
If dropping the name and just going with Queen, the title, both a title and a name, was sort of another middle finger to the family that she may or may not have murdered. But
Fair
I don't
enough.
know. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and it's highly possible that she also just maintained the decorum of just constantly being called Your Majesty.
Yeah. Yes. Very true.
And first name was never spoken. But I mean, but what did her husband call her? I mean, did he call her Cindy? Did he call her, babe, honey, sweetheart? Any of those things it could have taken place, and then the name was just lost from further records.
Yeah.
Wow.
I don't know.
Wow.
I feel, at this point, we do have some information, but I think this is a great case study, a great cold case that, just someone should look into. Maybe produce something about it.
Yeah. A documentary. There's so many layers to this.
Oh, so many.
I mean,
childhood abuse, potential murder, multiple murders, like strangers on a train, murder scenario potentially.
It's almost like an
abuse.
Agatha Christie if you think about it.
Yeah. And then so we go past all of that, and then we get to maiming and bloodletting, potential psychopathy, psychotic breaks, if this story about the birds is to be believed, and then a cover-up, a potential conspiracy and cover-up, and then just nothing, just 3 words: happily ever after. No information,
right?
Nothing else.
And
that just leaves more questions.
Yeah, questions.
Really
Lots of
something
questions
for someone to look into. Yeah.
And then there's this whole Disney thing, this Walt Disney thing, which many decades later, of course, but he really sugarcoats it. When creating his documentaries, he doesn't go into a lot of details, and just again, it gives me the heebie-jeebies, thinking, is he a descendant?
Yeah, his documentaries contain so many different facts, and in fact, he even distorts facts so much so that it's almost a work of fiction.
It is. Yeah. If you look at the actual records of the crimes, it almost seems like Disney created this work of fiction to glorify these two people. And that reeks of, is he a descendant of Cinderella and the Prince?
Yeah. They should really label that. They really should, because people might not know. Yeah,
they should label that as fiction.
Yes,
they
should.
Really should. Or based on a true story.
Right, but not actually true.
Right. Yeah. Because that's just misleading in so many ways, and we do that now with books and films. I guess it was done less way back when. But, we don't take things as gospel when somebody writes it 100, 200, 300 years later. And he made these films about, these documentary films about these cases. And they're really very sugar-coated. Granted, he was probably looking for a safe movie rating. If he had gotten an R movie rating, that's less money, and I get it. That's the business.
Yeah.
But G rated, he's taken out some serious elements.
Yeah.
Disturbing.
Very, very disturbing.
Yeah.
Well, it was wonderful. It was wonderful looking at these records. But now, you've talked about the Grimm's investigators. I think I'm going to do some more research and find out if they've ever found any other information on any other cases, because this is fascinating.
Because they seem to be very talented investigators, really, detailed in their findings. And again, we can't look at later documentaries that have sugar-coated things. If we look at the original records from these two investigators, they were the Sherlock Holmes and Watson of their time. And I think, yeah. I think they must have had more than one case.
Oh, they must have. Very true. I agree.
Yeah. Definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that's something we should look into for our next podcast, because it's disturbing. It's disturbing, and I think we're onto something with this investigative team, and I don't know if they were licensed investigators or they were just two brothers doing it on their own. But I think we really should look into that.
I agree.
Good idea.
Good times. Good times.
Good times. Good times. Good times. Good times.